In this lesson, we look at the classification of biodiversity. Here are the objectives. Now, there have been multiple schemes for classifying life over the years, but here we're going to look at one where life is divided into 3 domains. So, in this one, life is divided into bacteria, or true bacteria, which we'll call eubacteria. Eu means true. There are the eukaryotes, and then there are also the archaea. The archaea, which are sometimes also called archaebacteria, are like the eubacteria prokaryotes. They have no nuclei or membrane-bound organelles. And initially, they were classified as bacteria, but when further information came to light and it was seen that they actually shared some features with eukaryotes and had some that were completely distinct, they were regrouped into this 3rd domain of life. So the 3 domains are bacteria or eubacteria, archaea, and eukaryotes. Now, we can break eukaryotes up into 4 kingdoms. Those kingdoms being Animalia, the animals, Plantae, the plants, fungi, and Protista. Protista is a sort of grab bag group that contains everything that's not in the other 3. In other words, a eukaryote that's not an animal, plant, or fungus is by default a protist. Now, the first 2 levels we've seen of classification are the domain and then the kingdom, and we can keep going down to smaller and smaller levels. These groups are called taxa. That's the plural. And singular is a taxon. So a taxon is just a group. Domain, kingdom, those are taxa, and so are, in descending order, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. And we can use these to classify organisms. Let's look at the domestic cat as an example. The domestic cat is a eukaryote. It's an animal, so we've got its domain and kingdom already. It belongs to the phylum Chordata, and then the class Mammalia, the mammals. Continuing on, the order is Carnivora, the carnivores. The family name is Felidae. And the genus is Felis. And for the domestic cat, the species is Felis catus. You can see here that it has a 2-part name. The first part of the species name is actually the name of the genus, and then the second part is special to the species, and that's called the specific epithet, in this case, catus. This is called binomial nomenclature. So binomial nomenclature, binomial means 2, nomenclature means naming. In the case of the domestic cat, gives us Felis catus. And if we were typing this, we would italicize this. Also note that the genus is capitalized, but the specific epithet is not. Also, when this is being used multiple times, you might see it written out the first time in full like this, but then after that, the genus will be abbreviated and the specific epithet will be written out. And again, this would be in italics if we were typing it, so it would be F catus. Humans are Homo sapiens. Again, the genus is capitalized, the specific epithet is not. This would be in italics, and if this were repeated, we would write it as H. sapiens. As another example, you may have seen the bacterium E. coli written out. E here stands for Escherichia, that's the genus name, and coli is the specific epithet. Notice that this system, where the domain contains the kingdom, which contains the phylum, which contains the class, etc., can be thought of like a nested Venn diagram. So if that's the phylum, then a particular phylum may contain several classes, and those classes may each contain several orders, etc. Now, ideally, we would like these groupings to reflect evolutionary relationships, and we call that a natural classification. A natural classification reflects evolutionary relationships, and it does so because all the organisms in a given taxon share a common ancestor. So what that would mean would be all of the organisms in this order have a common ancestor, and all of the organisms in this order have a different common ancestor, but they share a common ancestor at the level of the class that I've drawn here in blue. Another way of thinking about that is to draw it as an evolutionary tree. This is called a phylogenetic tree. Phylogeny means evolutionary history. So phylogeny means evolutionary history. And so a phylogenetic tree is a tree that reflects evolutionary history and evolutionary relationships. Here's one for the cat family, and we see the domestic cat here. The domestic cat shares a common ancestor, that would be right there, with the European wildcat. And then they share a common ancestor here with the African wildcat. Each of these branching points represents a speciation event and a common ancestor of everything that comes to the right. So time is going in this direction here. So ideally, we would like our classification system, domain, kingdom, phylum, class, etc., to match the phylogenetic history of the organism, and we would call that a natural classification system. Sometimes new evidence comes to light, and recently that's especially DNA evidence, comes to light that results in reclassification. In other words, needing to move an organism from one taxon to another because new evidence shows that the old hypotheses about relationships were incorrect. And in fact, the creation of the domain archaea that I mentioned at the start of the lesson is an example of this kind of reclassification. So that's a look at classification of biodiversity and binomial nomenclature.